Alright, in this lecture I want to briefly discuss the hardware and software specifications for developing with the Unreal Engine. So I have this page here that documents the minimum and recommended hardware specifications. We have the recommended hardware. I would actually recommend a bit more RAM than this. I would actually recommend 16 GB or more. Then here we have the section, the requirements for programmers developing with the engine. So we have Visual Studio version. Visual Studio 2019 is recommended. But you can also use Visual Studio 2022. I would actually recommend that if you use the earlier versions of Unreal Engine 5, such as 5.0, that you stick with Visual Studio 2019, at least at time of recording, because I've had some issues with Visual Studio 2022, where I got some strange compile errors with JSON file incompatibilities and stuff like that. Graphics card drivers always install the latest stable release. Then we have an example, a typical system used at Epic. They demonstrate how much RAM they have. As I mentioned, 8 GB might work, but I would recommend more than that. My current system has 32 GB, but as you can see, they use 64 GB on their systems. Then an example of how they configure their hardware. They have an SSD for the operating system, so the OS drive, then another SSD for the data drive. They use a different workstation processor, the Xeon. You will likely use the typical gaming Intel or AMD processor, but just use something that has a similar spec to this. But do note, the fewer processor cores you have, the longer your compile times will take in Visual Studio, for example, so it's best to have more cores with these things. Also listed are the requirements for UE5 rendering features, for Lumen, for example, Nanite virtualized geometry, and so on. So you want to make sure that you actually meet the minimum requirements for this. One more page worth mentioning is the Setting Up Visual Studio page. This is going to list the Visual Studio version with the Unreal Engine version. So if you want to develop with Unreal Engine 4.25 or later, for example, so if you want to use an older version of the engine, then you can check this table here to see which version of Visual Studio you should be using with that. Then, as I mentioned, when installing Visual Studio, we can install the game development to C++ under the workloads. Okay, so you check that option, game development to C++. They do mention some additional options here that you can install as well. If you are unsure about the particular workloads that you have installed, you can check that by going to Tools, Get Tools and Features. That will bring up the Visual Studio installer. I'm demonstrating this with Visual Studio Community 2019. And if I scroll down, you can see I have game development with C++ installed. You can always install something else. So if I click on this here, for example, total space required, and then I can select the download, and then I can modify. And you can go to individual components to install individual components as well. This is especially useful if you get an error and you know what particular component needs to be installed. You can just come in here and select that particular component and install that. Also outlined on this page are the recommended settings for developers using Visual Studio with Unreal Engine. Basically the configuration of the toolbars and the controls on those toolbars, but I will actually step you through some of these in upcoming lectures. To wrap up, if you are still running older hardware and you intend to install the Unreal Engine and Visual Studio on an HDD, so a hard disk drive, then you will experience some slower compile times. Compiling on those drives are really slow, and it's definitely worth investing in an SSD, so a solid state drive, for Unreal Engine development, because that will save you a lot of time. Use SSDs for development and as well as installing your operating system on. And you can always use a hard disk drive for your media, so your video files, backups and so forth. But definitely not for development. Okay, you want to switch to an SSD for that. Alright, that is going to wrap up this lecture.